Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People, a podcast where we come together to empower each other through knowledge and discuss the issues that shape our everyday lives. All opinions and information shared in this podcast are held by the hosts alone and do not represent the stances of the University of Central Florida and the Department of Sociology.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Free the Mind, Free the People. I'm Halley Spencer, one of the co-hosts for this podcast.
And I'm Marina Rivera, the other co-host for this podcast.
And I'm Annie Jones, senior editor and the co-writer on the podcast.
Welcome back. Today, as we mentioned in the previous episode that just was released recently, we have had this idea of creating this three-part mini-series, which we're calling The Structure. And so the purpose of this mini-series is really to get down into, so what are the structures, what are the organizations that are behind all these issues that we're seeing today, and the issues that we personally, Halley and I previously mentioned, that were just making us angry and frustrated this whole summer. So as you know, or may not know, part one of this mini-series was on the Christian right and how they, throughout history, their roots have been seen in slavery, segregation, the bypassing of integration, then Roe v. Wade, anti-LGBTQ laws, and even recent opposition to critical race theory and the Black Lives Matter movement. So if you want to know more, definitely go check that out, and then come back here to part two.
And today we want to give a historical kind of review of who the NRA is, how they got into power, the role they play in U.S. politics and culture today. And really, again, our main goal is to apply the sociological imagination and concepts like intersectionality and the matrix of domination throughout this discussion.
And just to let people know now, this is kind of a trigger warning. We are focusing on the NRA, which means that this episode does discuss gun violence and mass shootings. So please feel free to stop listening to this episode if it becomes distressing at any point. That is perfectly okay. But moving forward, I want to give you kind of the overview of the important players from the beginning so you can follow along a little easier. So kind of to outline it for you, we're going to be talking about Ronald Reagan in two senses, as Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, and President Ronald Reagan. We're also going to be talking about the Black Panther organization. We're going to be discussing Harlan Carter, which was the president of the NRA in the 1980s. And finally, an important aspect of this is Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court case we also discussed in Marina's episode about Christian rights. So that's kind of to give you an overview. And basically, I want to frame this episode in a very specific way. When I started doing my research into the NRA, I started noticing something pop up along the way, and I wanted to make sure it's discussed quite early so you have this lens as you're listening to this episode. But basically, gun control has been used to uphold white supremacy. And I don't have much time to get into it from like the beginning of America's history, but from early America, one of the many reasons people didn't want slaves to become citizens was because they would gain the access to the constitutional right to bear arms, and that scared white people. Moving to the 1960s, gun control was used against the Black Panther organization, which I will discuss in a moment. And now, in the aftermath of George Floyd and January 6th, gun control has been used to uphold white supremacy. And so moving forward through this episode, I want to make sure we remember that lens because it's extremely important to this entire discussion. Just want to put that out there. But the beginning of the NRA is actually, it was created by former Union officers as a way to up soldiers' shooting skills because they thought that they kind of sucked. And so this was a way to educate a new generation of marksmen, and whether that be for like war or like hunting or just like recreational gun use, that was the early inception of the NRA. And believe it or not, this is also an important part. The NRA was pro-gun control for a long time of its history. They actually wanted gun control, often supported it, helped draft bills that supported gun control. So this is kind of the history of the NRA that they don't want you to know today. So as early as the 1920s, the NRA proposed a bill that required permits to have handguns. And so that was one of the earliest forms of gun control. And then in 1934, the NRA helped draft the National Firearms Act, and they supported it. And basically, this law said that no one can carry a concealed handgun in public without a permit from the local police. A permit would be granted only to a suitable person with a proper reason for carrying a firearm. The law also required gun dealers to report to law enforcement every sale they had, basically creating a registry for firearms. And lastly, the law imposed a 2-day waiting period on handgun sales, which this is very interesting because it's laws that we're trying to get passed today in some sense, but it's what they wanted already. They drafted this bill in the 1930s, and even the president of the NRA at the time said that, and I quote, "I do not believe in the general promiscuous toting of guns. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses." So it's just interesting that this is the kind of stuff they supported, and they never really believed in the strict strict Second Amendment view that they hold now. And this National Firearms Act was drafted in response to Prohibition era violence, and that's where it came from.
Okay, that sounds like a dog whistle. What Prohibition era violence? Who's committing this violence?
Right. So I'm glad you brought that up because it is kind of a dog whistle. And that's something you might hear throughout this whole episode is that whenever you hear the word criminals or felons or drug users or unsuitable or mentally ill, they kind of mean people of color, specifically Black people. And so in the sense of Prohibition era violence, a lot of people believe that prohibition was used to kind of control Black people, and this idea that they kind of just are lazy and drink. And so that stereotype is what created the prohibition, and then that's what they were responding to when they tried to take away guns, was basically making sure that people of color and immigrants couldn't get guns.
Good. I'm glad that we're talking about this. I always ask because I think it's sometimes really easy for us, even as sociologists, right, to fall into the language that power is manipulating us to use. So, for example, we talk about this in gender studies when we critique the term violence against women, because what that term does is it takes the perpetrator completely out of the equation, right? It's not even included in the phrase. And so some would argue that men's violence against women might be a more accurate way to not only discuss the problem but uncover the mechanisms, right, that are working to not only create the problem but hide it. And I think that, I know that racial ideologies and narratives in the US use really similar mechanisms to hide when we're talking about people of color.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to bring up that point as well, because in our previous episode, we discussed colorblind racism and colorblind language, specifically when it comes to Bonilla Silva's work. And we discussed that in the context of the civil rights movement and responses to it. Ironically, from the same, in a way, the same groups of people, like Ronald Reagan was one, with this idea of law and order and personal freedom, and really speaking about issues that are inherently racial or related to race, but in a way that doesn't mention race. And then you just present it as, oh, it's just I just want my personal choice. And so we see this here as well. And also, we also wanted to make the point that when it comes to gun control, this history of how everything is racialized is important, because when we're thinking of solutions to mass gun violence, and gun violence in general, we really need to understand that not everybody perceives guns in the same way, and that, for example, marginalized people of color, a lot of us feel unsafe. And personally, as a woman of color, studying supremacy, Christian nationalism, I would like to own a gun at some point to protect myself from, anybody that might want to harm me. And I think I don't speak for all people of color, of course, but I think that that is something that isn't uncommon from people that have faced violence all this time throughout history. So the main point here is, in this discussion, we're really moving beyond the debate about whether guns should exist or not, whether we should own guns or not, or ban them or not. We're trying to outline the structures behind these issues. So that's, and understand the complexity of this through an intersectional lens.
Really like that you're adding this into the conversation, Marina. I think intersectionality can really help us here. Like, first, that our positionality will help determine how we perceive guns, like you just mentioned with your experience. This helps us both like understand others, but I think this can also help us to understand the ebbs and flows of the NRA's positions over time, as Halley is starting to mention.
Right.
Absolutely.
So you guys brought up really good points, because I'm about to talk about how the NRA's position kind of shifted, and I'm also going to show a story about people of color who did own guns for their self-defense and how that was really important to them. So this leads into the Black Panther incident, basically. And so the Black Panther organization was like a Black Power organization in the 1960s, and they were really keen towards self-defense. And so in California in 1967, California passed the Mulford Act, which banned the open carry of firearms. And so this came after the Black Panthers started their police patrols. So police patrols were when Black Panthers would follow around police officers, and every time they pulled over a Black person, the Black Panthers would surround the incident while armed, basically tell the person that was being pulled over that they have certain rights, that they don't have to answer questions. They would shout out legal advice to the person that was being pulled over. And then if the police officer got aggressive, they would use their self-defense to stop the police officer. They basically said, if you shoot, I shoot you. And so that was their way of patrolling the police and making sure that the police were not brutalizing the people of color in California. And so the NRA came out in strong support of the Mulford Act, which banned the carry of firearms. And so the Black Panther were really upset because firearms was their way to protect themselves. And basically the Mulford Act was in direct response to the police patrols. People were in the government were getting scared, and so they passed this Mulford Act. And so the Black Panthers organized a march to the Capitol to draw attention to their case that they should be able to have the right to bear arms. So on May 3rd, 1967, 30 fully armed Black Panthers occupied the California state capitol. And they were very quickly disarmed by the state police and very quickly kicked out. And the very next day, the next day, Congress passed the first federal gun control law in over 30 years. So it's obvious that they were like, we don't want that happening again. Let's pass gun control. And so these laws for gun control, they expanded the federal licensing for gun dealers, and they clarified which people could not have guns. And they said that anyone previously convicted of a felony, dog whistle, the mentally ill, illegal drug users, all dog whistles, and also minors were not allowed to own firearms. And so people came out in statements saying that the new federal gun legislation was not passed to control guns, but to control Black people, because that's in effect what it did. And so this is a very interesting shift, because it's now obviously clear that they support gun control, but it is mostly to stop Black people, Black radicals from having the right to bear arms, from protecting themselves, from gaining power. And so this became really interesting because the Black Panthers' insistence on the right to bear arms, and it now is how the conservative Republicans feel about gun control as well. So the gun control laws of the late 1960s, designed to restrict the use of guns by Black leftist radicals, fueled the rise of the present day gun rights movement. And an ironic reversal is one that is predominantly white, rural, and politically conservative. And so the idea of this is that gun control was never used to restrict white people from owning guns, yet the modern movement that's what their fear is. And so it's interesting that the laws to control Black people has now allowed white people to gain more access to guns because that's what they fear, where realistically it was never used to restrict them in the first place. And so the NRA would go from backing gun control regulations to inhibit groups they felt threatened against, to then supporting not supporting any gun control legislation in the future. And that is where like the new NRA comes in. So in the 1970s, the NRA created their lobbying arm for the first time, and they appointed a lawyer named Harlan Carter to lead it. And so this is the first mentioning of Harlan Carter because he becomes very important. And so in the 1960s, the NRA leadership were in support of some gun control laws after the assassination of JFK. And many people in the NRA, its members, did not like that the leadership was supporting gun control. And it was in an era of rising crime rates. And so the people that were members of the NRA was upset at NRA leadership. And the leadership at the time, Maxwell Rich, basically said that they were going to be selling their building in Washington, D.C., and they're going to relocate their headquarters to Colorado Springs because they didn't want to do anything political anymore. They didn't want to do lobbying. They just want to focus on outdoor environmental hunting, like recreational activities with guns. They didn't want to be involved in politics at all. So other members of the NRA staged a coup during one of their national conventions and basically overthrew the sitting executives and created what we now know as the new NRA. And so basically, Harlan Carter became the new president, the one who was the lobbying arm. And this is what turned them into a lobbying powerhouse that was super committed to like an aggressive view of the Second Amendment. And they promised to oppose all types of gun control. And so this is what the new NRA is. And it's very interesting because the NRA at that point had very similar views to the right to own guns as the Black Panthers. They both viewed firearms as a way to protect themselves, and that was very important to them. They also shared a profound mistrust of law enforcement, both the NRA and the Black Panther. The NRA executive vice president at the time said that anyone who wears a badge has the government's go-ahead to harass, intimidate, and even murder law-abiding citizens. And they called federal agents, just jackbooted government thugs. So basically there is a related idea of being against law enforcement and for the right to guns. However, this like connection, that's basically where it ends. Like the NRA was still like inherently racist and didn't want Black people to own guns. It's not like the Black Panthers and the NRA were working together. It's just interesting to see how their views kind of aligned in some senses. And so that was a really interesting part of how the NRA changed. And so I'm going to talk about Harlan Carter now because he kept on coming up in my research. And I'm like, okay, who is this man? So I typed him into Google. He's personally, I believe, just a bad guy, just an overall not good person. So from the beginning of Carter's life, he lived in Texas. And one day he came home and he saw that his mom was upset because she believed some kids tried to steal her car. And so she got really upset. Harlan Carter got very upset and he tried to go out and find the kids that tried to steal her car. So he confronted some Mexican boys at a local watering hole, is what they called it. And he basically said, hey guys, I know you tried to steal my mom's car, get back to my house. And they were like, no, we didn't. Like, what the heck? We did not do that. And they're like, started getting into an argument. And so after they refused to come back to the house, Harlan Carter pulled out a gun and basically said, like, you need to come back to my house right now. And the boy was like hey man, like calm down, and kind of like push the gun out of the way, step back, and kind of laughed. And Harlan Carter was really upset that it didn't like induce a bunch of fear, so he shot the boy, and the boy ended up dying. And so Carter was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder and sentenced to 3 years in prison for the murder of this boy. And so he eventually got out after 2 years because the trial judge said that the jury instructions were confusing. I don't quite understand that part. But, you know, like rather than like steering clear of guns and being like, okay, I'm not going to mess with that. That was really crazy. He then like doubled down, and he would soon become the first head of the US Border Patrol under President Truman. So just to show an overall view of what this man is like that has now taken over the NRA and is now causing it to move forward into politics, Carter in the future said that this group would be so strong and dedicated that no politician in America, mindful of his career, would want to challenge their legitimate goals.
And they were right.
Yeah, and they were right. He was so right about that. And so that just kind of shows the overall like attitude of the NRA at the time, who's in leadership, what they now stand for. When you have someone at the head of an organization that's like outwardly racist and uses violence and like intimidating tactics, that's kind of the organization that now comes out of the NRA. And that is like really scary to now know that this is how the NRA is moving forward. So moving into politics as they kept going, in 1980, the NRA made its first ever endorsement for president, which was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was also the governor of California when the Mulford Act was passed. And that was the act we discussed during the Black Panther incident. Ronald Reagan, governor at the time, signed that legislation. So the NRA, they like each other. He was a lifelong member of the NRA, and so the NRA obviously wanted to support him. So that was really interesting.
Yes, I think that that's so ironic, but at the same time, it makes sense that in the racialization that we've already talked about, like we keep saying the word racialization, but yes, like again, going back to everything that happened with Harlan Carter and what the NRA is, and that it came out of him, like staging that coup, and how who he was, and then became the head of the Border Patrol. Like all these things, we speak of them without that context. Like people talk about guns and even, I mean, immigration's pretty overt about race, but even then people swear that they are colorblind, but they will talk about Border Patrol, they will talk about guns, the NRA, violence, and so to me it's ironic because obviously knowing if you stage the whole coup because you thought that the NRA was wrong for wanting to embrace gun control after, of course, JFK and all of that, but then so you do that, but then you also endorse somebody that did sign something for gun control in the past, then it seems ironic, but then it makes sense because, oh, of course, to them it doesn't even apply because at the time the gun control was for a very specific group of people, not for us. So the whole point of the NRA really is, if we contextualize it in that history, and we should, is let's protect the right for a specific group of people to own guns and use them, but forget about the others who are just criminals, you know?
Right.
So yeah.
And so yeah, they supported Ronald Reagan even though he supported gun control, signed a gun control bill, but in like the end, it's just because the gun control bill stopped Black people from carrying guns, and in the NRA's eyes, that was a good thing. And so that's where their support came in. But yeah, that's a really good point. And moving forward in 1981, Reagan then had an attempted assassination, and so this was like really interesting because a man who supported the NRA, now against gun control, was affected by gun violence personally. But 2 years after the assassination attempt, Reagan spoke at an NRA convention in 1983, and he spoke against gun control. He said that hardcore criminals will use guns, and guns don't make criminals. What they need to do is lock them up and throw away the key, and that is the best gun control we could ever have. And that's what he stated. And so he also said that gun control doesn't stop criminals from getting guns either way, which was an interesting stance to take because the person who shot him got his gun completely legally. He broke no laws attempting to buy the gun that then shot him and his secretary at the time. So that point was very interesting. And he also showed support to Harlan Carter, who we just talked about. And this was a huge move to gain support from conservatives for the 1984 presidential election, which he then ended up winning. So this just goes to show the type of now pull that the NRA has on politics. They have a president speak at their convention, so then they can then win an election, and that happens now moving forward regularly in American politics. But after the assassination attempt in the 1990s, there was a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. And so the NRA started facing setbacks. And this was because after the assassination attempt, there was kind of a movement for gun control. And in 1993, a law known as the Brady Bill, named after Reagan's press secretary who was shot during that assassination attempt, this new law was created. And basically it also created a domestic ban on assault weapons. So we've heard recently about this domestic assault weapons ban and how it expired, and this is where it all began. But the NRA started getting smart. They were like, okay, well, we can't stop these gun control laws right now, but what we can do is we can stop research into gun violence. And so in the 1990s, the NRA was able to persuade Congress to pass legislation forbidding the CDC from using federal dollars to promote or advocate for gun control. And this basically meant, as it was moving forward, that any research done by the CDC could not discuss gun violence anyway. And this was like, moving forward, this is something that still affects us today. And this is one of the greatest things that has happened that now affects how we experience gun violence, in the modern time. Along with that is the idea that federal assault weapons ban under George W. Bush and a Republican Congress, it expired and they decided not to keep it in law. And in 2010, Citizens United was passed, which was something we discussed in the past episode.
The other big thing I think from that time period is Columbine's effects, and specifically the NRA's response. So we were all pretty young for this, but in the late 90s, right, Columbine happened, and in the direct time period after, the NRA was planning to hold their convention actually in Denver, so near where Columbine happened. And this leaked phone call has come out since then of the NRA, these kind of leadership, these people in leadership working to first decide whether they should hold a convention, and when they decide to justify that. And the justification really was, if we cancel this convention, we open ourselves up to looking like we're guilty. And so what I think is so interesting about that is the same exact thing happened this past year with Uvalde, where a school shooting happened, an absolutely terrible school shooting happened, and the NRA still held their convention nearby in the time period after. So all of this really keeps guns culturally significant, but that Columbine moment seems to be one that really was an important moment for the NRA.
Right, and during the Columbine situation and moving forward towards Sandy Hook, the NRA gets a very strict message after every single mass shooting. They kind of say the same things, and it's solidified during those two mass shootings. And basically, they will say like thoughts and prayers to the victims. This is not a time to talk about gun control. That's too political. They'll blame gun violence on like video games and mental health and Hollywood, and then they'll basically put fear back in you, saying that no government organization can protect you the way that your own personal gun can. And so this strict response to mass shootings has now become obvious all the time, and it gets people very upset, and that their response is kind of repeated over and over again. And so that's something we've seen in like every mass shooting moving forward when the NRA makes a statement. So that's a really good point, Annie. Thank you. But then moving forward in 2020, the New York Attorney General seeks to dissolve the NRA. And this is because it's been found that the leaders have been diverting millions of organizational dollars to pay for their own lifestyle. So this includes like private jets and trips to the Bahamas and just a lot of fraud, abuse, and greed. And this upset a lot of their members that send them money. They felt like their money was not being used in like the correct way. And so that was really frustrating for a lot of NRA members.
I think upset and frustrating are understatements here. I don't know. Just from my personal experience in my lifetime, it seems like this was the first time that like cultural faith in the NRA, at least from the right, was really, really shook. I mean, the context of all this is important, right? We're living in times where our faith in the government and authorities, I mean, in the U.S. in general, is pretty low. So I think that this came at just kind of like the perfect time for people to kind of be completely fed up with an organization like the NRA. It'll be really interesting to see whether that they can grow from here or if that was like a permanent damage to the organization.
Right. And so that is a perfect leeway into just like the NRA and money and their funding and how they get all this money in the first place. So the Political Victory Fund is the NRA's PAC. And so this is how they get a lot of money to fund political campaigns and endorse candidates. And so I mentioned Citizens United earlier, but in 2010, Citizens United was passed. And the NRA has always been a big spender, and they always had a lot of effect on presidential candidates and just like people running for office. But NRA's political spending tripled since Citizens United, and it was already a lot. And so basically the Supreme Court allowed unlimited political spending by corporations, and this meant that they had a lot more push and pull in politics. And they their PAC is considered a 501c4, which is a social welfare organization. And this means they can receive unlimited contributions without disclosing donors to the public. So a lot of this money that they get is not accounted for in any way, and we cannot say who gives them all of their money. But we have found some people that do, and it is stated who it is in some senses. So in 2012, the NRA received $6.6 million from two groups controlled and funded by the Koch brothers. And that's very important because the next episode, we're going to be talking about the Koch brothers and their effects on politics. And so this continued in 2014, and they funneled $4.9 million into the NRA. Gun manufacturers like Smith & Wesson also came out saying that they have given large donations to the NRA, which makes sense because the NRA creates laws that then protect these large gun manufacturers. And so moving forward in 2016, the NRA had more money than they'd ever had before. They had $419 million, which was up from the prior years. And about 30 million of this money they used on behalf of Donald Trump's campaign. And so they put a lot of money into the 2016 election. And they spent $54.4 million in the 2016 election combined. So in everyone running in 2016, they spent $54 million, which has a strong effect. Money basically wins in politics, and money is power. And this is quite obvious that it shows in the laws that are passed. So in 2013, after Sandy Hook, there was a gun control bill that was attempted to be passed, and it failed. And nearly all of the 46 senators who voted against the amendment had significant contributions from the National Rifle Association or other gun groups. So it's clear that this money that the NRA has affects what we see as citizens in the United States. So in the 13th Congress in 2012, 213 members of Congress received NRA dollars, And over 80% of the candidates funded by the NRA won their House and Senate seats. So that just goes to show like the intense power that the NRA has in who gets elected and what laws are passed.
And we can, I would say we can see the same pattern, like as you were going through all of this, the same patterns, and I'm sure Annie will touch on that in the next episode with the Koch brothers. But we see the same pattern as we saw with the Christian right. Like all they not only have money that goes directly into policy and legislation, but they also find other ways to control. Like in this case, they control research on gun violence. So, and then they do these tricks. They find these loopholes with the law so that they don't have to report what, like their finances. They don't have to be transparent about that. So again, it goes back to that obscuring what we keep talking about and what we're trying to expose here, I guess, in a way. It's just that obscuring aspect and how well they know the system. It's not like they don't know what they're doing. They know exactly how to manipulate the system to get the results that they want. And that's easy when they already have so much power. So that's something we want to keep in mind as we listen to all of these things that seem to be separate throughout history, but it all goes back to the same thing.
Absolutely. And it's just like sad that now it's either impossible to win elections without like a huge amount of money from PACs, or people are too scared, like people who are running for office are too scared to come out against the NRA because they will get just like body slammed. Like there's no way to get away with doing that and not receiving a whole lot of backlash. And so that creates a Congress, a political system that works off of the lobbying money of organizations and not the people who want certain laws passed. It's not about the citizens anymore. It's who has the most money. That's who has power in politics. Those are the laws that are going to be passed, and it's not about us anymore. And so that's really sad. But so now that we talked about how much money went into Trump's presidency, we can talk about where I think this all kind of comes together and accumulates, which is the January 6th insurrection. And so it was found that, like, you know, a lot of people at the insurrection were armed, whether with guns or like their own type of weapons, less harmful weapons. There were a lot of people armed at the insurrection. And there was one person who was found with a loaded handgun, a loaded rifle, a loaded shotgun, a crossbow with bolts, several machetes, a stun gun, and 11 mason jars containing a flammable liquid with a hole punched in the top of each jar. So it was clear that people, when they came to the insurrection, were hoping to incite violence. But I just discussed with the Black Panther incident a situation where people also were armed going to a Capitol building, and the same result did not happen. They were quickly unarmed, and quickly gun control laws were passed the very next day. It was clear that when it was a group of Black people that were protesting with arms, that they immediately got like so many restrictions against them. But when a group of mostly white men go to a Capitol armed, the same thing does not happen. And that just goes to show like how this is a racialized issue, how in general, people of color with guns will always get a harsh sentence compared to white people with guns. And it's because gun control was never supposed to stop white people with guns. It was always supposed to stop Black people with guns. And so I think just the comparison of the insurrection to the Black Panther protest is just like a very interesting lens to look through all of this.
Yes, and we can also go back to the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in the summer of 2020, where there were literal like National Guard tanks going through neighborhoods and cities. And, you know, that we saw this, like there's footage of it. So it's clear that the response that Black people and people of color get when they are, and Black Lives Matter protests were not armed. Like that's the first point we need to make. They were not armed. And yet they were met like an army. So And I think that also speaking to the insurrection and the dynamics that were going on in there, unfortunately, Christianity, and not all Christians and not all Christianity, but a specific group of Christian, typically white conservative Christians, there is this intersection between them and guns and wanting to protect their rights to own guns, and by extension oppose gun control. So at least in my own research, like going back to what we talked about in part 1, first, the Gospel Coalition, which again, a media company that is funded by conservative evangelical groups, they even had a whole debate on gun control from a Christian viewpoint. And in that panel, if you watch it, and we'll actually link it down below, as usual, there were some Christians that did bring up arguments towards gun control, of course, but more, I guess, the part that I would focus on is that there were others that used the Bible to support gun ownership, and they used the argument of self-defense as a God-given right, and also freedom from the government. So you see the same arguments from different viewpoints, but it's the same argument again and again. And another thing, during the January 6th insurrection, pastors were arrested among the people that participated, including some from Florida, including some from where I live. I have a link below for that article. Ironically, they live down the street from me, just so you know. Found that out through my research. Yeah, and I believe they're out. So anyways, so then along the same lines, like if you watch the footage of the insurrection, there were Jesus Saves flags, there were crosses, and even the QAnon shaman, as he calls himself, he gave a whole prayer. So when they entered and occupied the Capitol building, there's also footage of him giving a whole prayer to the Christian God. So there's that. And lastly, Christian nationalism, the recent research that sociologists have done, Christian nationalism is actually associated with opposition to stricter gun control laws. And so all of these things, it just shows the interconnection of the issues that we're discussing here. And also, almost forgot, when it comes to these peaks of social unrest, statistically, gun sales increase. And we also include a link below to that. But yeah, so I think it all comes down to, and obviously we can't simplify it, we can't reduce it to a single issue, but as we can see, this system is meant to protect some people and meant to control others. So when it comes to gun control, Christian nationalism, as we'll know, free speech in Annie's episode, all of it, there's a structure there. There's something that they're trying to protect. And ultimately, as we've discussed previously, it's a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic state that they're trying to, or at least social order that they're trying to preserve through these responses. And unfortunately, guns are a tool for these groups specifically.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as we are closing out, I want to stop us here. I want us all to remember that although we're using sociology to analyze the NRA as an organization or even culture around guns, we have to recognize at the end of the day that real people's lives are at the heart of these analyses, right? We also, I think, should recognize that oftentimes the victims of gun violence are our most marginalized people, right? And vulnerable members of society. So children, ethnic and racial minorities, LGBTQ plus people, religious minorities, all of these groups are disproportionately affected by gun violence. So we want to take a second to recognize and remember all of the victims of gun violence as we close out this episode.
Yeah, and while this episode discusses gun violence in general, we haven't even touched on the issue of how guns are connected to increased rates of death by suicide and domestic violence. And these issues add a new layer of like gender identity and race to them. So just know that gun violence goes way beyond what we discussed today. We could have multiple episodes about this issue because it does not stop here. And so we should remember that moving forward as well.
Yeah, so again, to close out the episode, we just like to reiterate that our conversation here does go beyond a guns versus no guns, ban guns versus don't ban guns debate. We're really trying to point listeners back to these intersecting structures and systems of oppression that are at play in issues of mass gun violence. And the organizations that have played a role in it. So moving forward, though, as we've mentioned, this mini-series is a 3-parter. And so for part 3, Annie is actually going to lead us through that conversation about the Koch brothers and their strategic ways of getting and allocating funds and using those funds for legislation and their campaigns about free speech with quotes and especially on university campuses, which is particularly relevant for us as UCF students. We have witnessed people like speakers like Matt Walsh who have received backlash understandably, based on the ideologies that he is promoting in his speeches and all the things that he produces. So Annie is going to lead us through that conversation and the debates that we're currently having about how to best respond to such a challenge, specifically at college campuses. So please tune in for that, and thank you so much for listening in. We hope that you'll take some time to listen through all 3 episodes of this mini-series, and that this will hopefully give you some more context as to what is really behind all of these issues that we see today, and maybe some new ways that we can respond to them based on the new information that we're hopefully bringing through our conversations. So, yeah.
Don't forget the NRA used to support gun control. Bye, everyone.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
We'd also like to thank the University of Central Florida Department of Sociology for their generous support of this podcast.